Hi, Founder fans. Jason here, and today's founder is John Dickinson. We're going to discuss his later life because we need to welcome back Dr. Jane Calvert. Dr. Jane, thank you so much for coming back.
Thanks for having me.
Absolutely. Now, I'll point our audience to some of our earlier conversations to find out about the earlier parts of John Dickinson's life, but together we've journeyed through most of it. So, as the Constitutional Convention comes to a conclusion, where does John Dickinson stand in regards to the Constitution itself, his views on it, and his efforts to help get it ratified?
Yeah, so he left the convention a few days early because he wasn't feeling well, and his good friend George Reed signed the Constitution on his behalf, wrote his name, and pretty much as soon as he got back home, he started working on a series of letters, another series of letters, in order to convince people to ratify the Constitution. And so these were called the Fabius letters. He was his pen name was Fabius, and these letters were directed towards the ordinary people. He wanted to really make the Constitution relatable. He wanted to educate them about it, like he always did. And so he wrote these letters that were, so we're more familiar with the Federalist Papers, but actually those were not read widely outside of New York. They were written, by New York for New Yorker, New Yorkers, and they were very, very erudite and detailed and dense, and the ordinary people weren't going to follow those. But Dickinson, before they got going, he wanted to reach out to the ordinary people. So he wrote the Fabius letters, and they were very engaging, and they were, I believe, they were actually reprinted more widely than the Federalist Papers, and those people who were in favor of the Constitution liked them. George Washington, he didn't know who wrote them, but he said, "Wow, this person really knows a lot about the Constitution, and these are great, and everybody should read them." And so I don't think Dickinson was known as the author until he reprinted them later with a second set of Fabius letters in, I believe it was 1797, and then he became, and that second set was on France and America's relation with France. And so at that point he became known as the author, but he was able to keep it secret for longer than the farmers' letters.
Very interesting. I'm glad you pointed out about the Federalist Papers too. That was, as you were saying, it was more written for the elite. Well, it was written to convince the delegates to the New York Ratification Convention to ratify more than the general person. So speaking of which, does Dickinson attend Pennsylvania's ratification convention?
No, he was not living in Pennsylvania anymore. He was in
In
Delaware, and
Delaware.
when he
Oh,
was at the Constitutional Convention, he was a delegate from Delaware. And no, he was not at the Delaware ratifying convention. But Delaware, as you know, was the first state. That's its motto, the first state. And I think it's very clear that Dickinson had a lot of influence on Delaware becoming the first state to ratify the Constitution.
very interesting. So the Constitution gets ratified. Spoiler alert. And Dickinson is, as you said, living in Delaware. What role does Dickinson play, if any, in the new government or the Delaware's segment of the new government?
So, he had served as governor of Delaware, or president, as he was called at the time, and that was in 1781 to 82. And but then he was not in it after that. And but so shortly after the federal convention, Delaware had its own constitutional convention, and he was not just a member of that convention, he was actually elected the president of that convention. And so Delaware then rewrote its state constitution, and that was actually Dickinson's last. He was serving as a judge. He was the judge of the Chancery Court. He was a judge, an appeals court judge, but he was really not feeling all that well. So he was trying to sort of resign his positions. And after he served as president of the Delaware Constitutional Convention, that was I believe it was his last formal public role. I suppose he might have served as a judge after that at some point, but I'm not sure yet. But from that point on, he really was mainly just a private citizen, but he was still very active in politics, and he led a citizens group against the Jay Treaty, which he was very much opposed to. He served as kind of a informal advisor to many politicians, including George Logan, and I think actually George Logan of Pennsylvania was kind of his protege. And Dickinson, I think, was very influential with him on a number of issues, including sort of democratic agrarianism and George Logan's very interesting trip to France, where he tried to make the peace with France. Um, so Dickinson was, he was a Democratic Republican. He served also as an informal advisor to Thomas Jefferson when he became president, and the Attorney General. And so he was still really. Oh, what I meant to say about George Logan is that I think some of the legislation that George Logan either proposed or helped pass through the Senate was stuff that Dickinson wanted passed. So I wouldn't go so far to say that George Logan was his puppet, but certainly they were working very closely together.
Right.
So he had the citizens group against the Jay Treaty. He started taking on these more not just interest in policy. He was very interested in education. He was very interested with the United States relation with France. He became just a complete Francophile, and he was, contrary to what most people would assume, he was a very strong supporter of the French Revolution. And so he was really concerned that America retain France as an ally, because look, I mean, if it weren't for France, we would not have won the revolution.
Right.
And oh, I mean, come on. I mean, we did not have the armed forces to beat the British, and the French supplied those forces. So anyway, Dickinson felt very loyal to France, and he wrote three more publications. He wrote the second set of Fabius letters, and then a couple other pamphlets on France. He wrote about education, but aside from those things, his main concern late in life was philanthropy. And so he and his wife took a very active role in trying to, basically on social justice issues. He founded or helped to found several schools. Probably the most noteworthy of the schools was Westtown Friends, which is still in existence. It's the most prominent Quaker boarding school. And so he gave the money for that. He founded several other schools for poor children, for Black children. He gave land. He gave the use of his quarries for stone, and he also did other things like he was making sure that he freed all of his slaves at that point. He tried to write abolition legislation for Delaware. He also and then he gave a significant amount of money to help establish the first prison reform society in the Western world, because he was concerned about conditions in prisons and prisoners' rights. And this was something he'd always been concerned about, justice. And Quakers were very much concerned with trying to make prison a place where someone could reform and not just for punishment. In fact, they were less concerned with punishment and more about reform.
Very interesting.
And a lot of people don't realize that Quakers kind of invented the practice of solitary confinement, but they didn't mean it as a punishment. They meant it as a way for the individual to go inward and find God and come out reformed. Whereas now, of course, it's misused as a punishment.
Right. So I hope this isn't too far out of left field, but the prison reform, I know Dr. Benjamin Rush was also very much involved in his own way. And when you're talking about Dickinson, who spent a good portion of his life in Philadelphia with Dr. Rush, I was wondering if, from your research, you've run into Dr. Rush at all, and if they had any workings together of when it came to prison reform or anything of that nature.
They were very close friends.
Because Dr. Rush was also very forward-thinking when it came to abolition also, I believe.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. So I would say Dickinson and Rush, I mean, they were very close friends. Rush was one of his closest friends. And in fact, Benjamin Rush founded Dickinson College in John Dickinson's honor. So Benjamin Rush was a huge fan of Dickinson's, and it was, it was mutual. And so I don't know that they worked on prison reform together. I think Dickinson really more provided funds and rather than being sort of, someone in the trenches with his sleeves rolled up and, working. But yeah, they were. Dickinson was, I would say, compared to Rush, maybe a little bit more sort of progressive than Rush on things like women's rights. Rush was more about like, oh yes, a woman should be a good companion to her husband. That's forward thinking for women. And Dickinson was more like, no, actually, women should write political treatises and serve as models for like virtuous behavior for everybody, and they're remarkable. And so he wasn't just about like having women be wives.
Right. I think,
in fact,
yeah.
one of his daughters chose not to marry. So
I'm sorry, what was that last part?
one of his daughters, his elder daughter, chose to remain single.
One of Dickinson's daughters.
Mm-hmm.
Oh,
Yes.
very interesting. Very interesting.
Yeah.
I guess the reason I guess Dr. Rush was, he's credited for a lot of what he did with mental health. So I suppose that's what prison reform, mental health. I know it's definitely not the same, but I guess that's what rang about.
I mean, I think that they're certainly related because at the time, a lot of so-called lunatics were locked up, and so the Pennsylvania Hospital was there for a place for lunatics to go rather than just a jail.
Right.
So yeah, I mean, at that time, Philadelphia was, the leading center of enlightenment in the New World. So it was, kind of a small p progressive place where science and humanity were sort of the watchwords. And Dickinson, though he wasn't in Philadelphia anymore, he was in Wilmington. He certainly was, spent gave a lot of his wealth to these causes to make sure that poor and disadvantaged children were educated, and women were advanced, and prisoners were treated better, and the relationship with France was well, he wanted it to be flourishing. And so anyway, yeah, these were his concerns late in life. And also he was put forth for public office several times after he'd retired, and he didn't really want to serve again. And he was pressured by people. And in fact, the last time he was put forward for the Senate, I believe, it was the fall of 1806. No, the fall of 1807. Sorry, fall of 1807. Just a few months before he died, he was on the ballot and agreed to serve, but he was not elected. But yeah, he was still seen as a champion of the Republic, and of course partisanship was pretty vicious at that time. So anyone who didn't like the Democratic Republicans was going to attack him, but yeah, he was still a very active figure right up until, in fact, just the February. He died on February 14th, 1808, and just, I believe, the month before, his name appeared in the paper as someone who had given advice to Caesar A. Rodney for, who was it, the Attorney General, wasn't he at that time?
He was Attorney General at some point.
Right, and so Dickinson, made the papers that, Attorney General Rodney has gotten advice from John Dickinson about, some matter or other, and that was just the month before he died. So he was active, right up until the very end.
But it's very interesting. Someone leaked that information that, whatever topic they were talking about may have been controversial, but I heard he got it from Dickinson, and everyone's like, oh, okay.
Yeah, right. I don't know what was going on that front, but another point that I just like to bring up was So, we hear about the deathbeds of Washington and especially like Jefferson and Adams, who died on the same day, and Adams is all like jealous, like, oh, Thomas Jefferson's still alive, and he's all upset about that.
Oh, is that how you
Dickens,
interpret it, huh?
oh, of course, yes. I mean, he's so Thomas Jefferson still lives. It was were he's
Right.
close to
But you interpret it as jealousy. I see. I've always gotten the impression.
Adams. Adams is so jealous. I
I
mean,
always got the impression. I know he always was kind of, that kind of guy, but I always got the impression that he had gotten over their differences and was like excited Jefferson still lives. Which, like, side note for viewers who don't know, Jefferson had died a few hours beforehand.
Yeah. No. So they were friends at that point. They'd gotten over their differences, but that didn't stop Adams from being jealous. He was jealous of everybody.
Fair enough. I never heard anyone phrase like that. It makes a lot of sense.
Well,
but you were saying,
Dickinson's, Dickinson's deathbed. So we don't know exactly what he died of, but he slipped into sort of delirium in the last couple of days, and his dying concern that he was kind of raving about on his deathbed was not who of his opponents was still alive or whatever. He was concerned about the possibility of Napoleon coming over to the North American continent and attacking America. So he was very, very concerned just about whether that would happen, how it would happen. So that's what he was kind of mumbling about, as his last thoughts were for the security of this new nation.
right. That's amazing, and justifiably so. If I understand right, Napoleon wanted to, but there was a bout of malaria in the Caribbean at some point that essentially halted those goals for him. But it's a justifiable concern. We often overlook that when we talk about the early days of the Republic. Now, I know his death is a great place to end, but you had said something earlier that I'd like to backtrack on a little bit. You've been talking about Dickinson's wealth and how he spent it in many fascinating ways. And he was primarily a lawyer, but you had used the phrase quarries, as in multiple quarries?
Well, I don't know how many he had, if he had multiple ones, but he probably owned more land in the Delaware Valley than any single person. He had thousands of acres that he and his family had acquired over the years. I mean, so when his father around the time Dickinson was born, his father so tobacco prices were pretty poor, and a lot of planters were unable to pay for their farms, and so or their plantations, and so Samuel Dickinson, John's father, was snapping up these plantations for really cheap. So he had land in Maryland and in the lower counties, and then Dickinson continued to add land, throughout his life. So he owned property, lots of tenant properties, lots of agricultural properties. At least one quarry. I don't know if he had multiple quarries, but yeah, at least one quarry. And he just really was an extraordinarily wealthy man, and put that money to philanthropic purposes, rather than just kind of hoarding it or spending it on slaves or whatever.
Right. It's fascinating. I mean, then as now, I suppose, if you have money, you want to diversify your assets. I never considered him as a miner, but I suppose it's good a profession to say, especially when you're owning all this property. As you said, there's so many different things that could be done with it, and it's always fascinating to remember how many different streams of income they may have had. We like to think of John Dickinson, the lawyer, but it's super interesting that he was, mine owner.
You would not get rich being a lawyer in the colonies or the early republic, because most of a lawyer's work was just chasing down small debts, and so you pretty much would make, unless you got cases in the admiralty court where you would get like a cut of the prize, if a ship was taken. But otherwise, you made your money not as a lawyer, but as a landowner, or a merchant. And Dickinson was both. He sold goods and had property, but he had, I would say, probably most of his money came from his tenant properties. And what's interesting about that is he sort of had a reputation for charging really high rents, but only for white people. For black people, like his former slaves, he would only charge like a nominal amount for like $1 a year or something like that.
Really?
Yeah.
That's fascinating. A little bit strange that he would. I guess he had the nicest properties, so he's charging the most rent, and not fighting for the most tenants. I don't know. I'm not a property owner in that nature, so I.
Right, right. No, and I think it's it's fair to kind of think about these low rents that he charged African American tenants as reparations, because of the people he used to hold in bondage, and he wanted to make sure that they were well taken care of, and they weren't that their lives were decent and livable after when they had their freedom.
Right. You're trying to give them the economic opportunity that they had been talking about this whole time.
Yes, yes, right, exactly,
Well,
exactly.
that's fascinating. So we've now spoken, what, 4 or 5 times about John Dickinson. We've done a very thorough review of John Dickinson's life. You, as someone who's been spending years collecting his works and papers, of all the things that John Dickinson did in his life, which I'm sure we've already covered it, but what to you really stands out? Maybe the top two or one or two things that really stand out that you would really prefer people know about Dickinson.
Well, so I guess I would say that he was probably among the American leaders, the first and only one, at least, around the time of the Declaration of Independence, who really had a sense of human rights as we think of them today. Because most people at that time thought in terms of the rights of Englishmen, and so your rights were bounded by your nationality and your gender and your religion and your property ownership. And Dickinson was actually one of the few people who was thinking in very expansive terms about human rights that everybody, regardless of gender or skin color or economic status, everybody should possess. And so that leads us into these other noteworthy things, like his liberating his slaves, his advocating rights for women, rights for prisoners, rights for Native Americans, that sort of thing. So if we kind of have rights as human rights as one category, the other thing I would say is Dickinson was really a very ardent advocate for peace, but not a pacifist. So wanting diplomatic, foreign affairs and foreign relations to be managed with diplomatic solutions rather than war, and that there would always be some means through process to achieve one's goals or the country's goals without bloodshed. So that those I think would be the two big things that people should know about him.
Well, I definitely couldn't have said it better myself. Dr. Jane, thank you so much for the time you've taken to teach us so much about John Dickinson. Please feel free to come back with any other founders that you've learned about along the way at a future date.
Well, maybe another time we could talk about John Dickinson's historiographical problem, which is to say the history that was written after his death and why he was left out. That's a whole other conversation.
The history of John Dickinson. That sounds fascinating. I can't wait to talk to you again about it. Founder fans, thank you so much for watching. Obviously, a big thanks to Dr. Jane Calvert. I am going to put down in the description links to all of what she's working on, so make sure you check it out. Thank you again, and we will be back with another founder for you tomorrow.